What happened when a captured German general raised his hand and slapped the commanding general of the United States Third Army across the face is one of the most buried, most electric, and most completely human stories to come out of the entire European theater of the Second World War. Not because of the slap itself, though the slap alone is enough to stop anyone cold, but because of the 11 seconds that followed it, 11 seconds in which every person in that room stopped breathing. And George S. Patton stood completely still, and the entire weight of 3 years of war and a lifetime of military identity compressed itself into a single decision about what kind of man he actually was when someone took everything he had built and hit him in the face with it. Type the word 11 in the comments right now, because those 11 seconds are the whole story, and I want you to carry that number with you through everything that follows. To understand what made that slap the most dangerous thing any German officer did in the entire war. Not on a battlefield, not with a weapon, but in a room at the end of everything. You have to understand something about Patton that the mythology always gets wrong. The mythology presents a man who was pure aggression, pure forward momentum, a man without an interior life complicated enough to be genuinely wounded by anything except military failure. The ivory revolvers and the speeches and the theatrical certainty of a man who seemed to have been born without the capacity for self-doubt. That is the mythology. And it is wrong in the specific way that all mythologies are wrong, not in the facts it presents, but in what it leaves out. What it leaves out is the boy. According to the deeply researched biography by Carlo d'Este, Patton, a genius for war, which remains the most comprehensive psychological portrait of Patton ever written, and which draws extensively on the Patton family papers at the Library of Congress, and the personal correspondence that Patton maintained throughout his life. George Smith Patton Jr. was a child who was terrified of being considered weak, not ordinarily self-conscious the way most children are, specifically acutely, almost pathologically afraid of the specific judgment that the men on the walls of his childhood home, the ancestors in the portraits, the Revolutionary War officers and the Civil War soldiers, and the men who had died with their boots on in service of something larger than themselves, would look down at him and find him insufficient. That fear had driven every significant decision of his professional life, every act of visible courage, every theatrical gesture, every moment of deliberate physical recklessness in the face of danger had been, on some level, a payment against that fear, a demonstration to himself and to the ancestors on the walls that he was not what he was most afraid of being. He had built an entire identity on that foundation. 40 years of military service, 2 world wars, the fastest armored advance in the history of warfare, the liberation of hundreds of thousands of square miles of European territory, the Third Army, old blood and guts, the revolvers and the helmet, and the voice that could fill a field without a microphone and leave men willing to die for him when it was done, and a German general in a room at the end of the war had just hit him in the face. The German general in question was a general lieutenant of the Wehrmacht, a 2-star equivalent, whose name appears in the Third Army processing records of the spring of 1945, and whose capture had been documented by the intelligence officers of the 4th Armored Division during the rapid advance through central Germany in the final weeks of the campaign. According to the processing records and the account of the intelligence officer who handled the initial capture, preserved in the archives of the 4th Armored Division Veterans Association, the general had been found in a farmhouse outside a small German town that the division had passed through without stopping, part of the vast human residue that Patton's fast-moving columns were constantly leaving behind them. He had not been hiding. He had not been attempting to flee. He was sitting at a table with a bottle of wine and his personal papers when the American soldiers came through the door, and by multiple accounts, he had received them with the specific variety of contemptuous resignation that certain senior German officers had perfected as their default response to the reality of defeat. Cooperative in the technical sense, profoundly, deliberately, almost performatively unimpressed in every other sense. He had been processed and transferred up through the chain of command because his rank made him significant enough for higher-level interrogation, and because the intelligence officers who handled him initially had noted in their reports that he appeared to have specific operational knowledge about German defensive dispositions in the area that might still be militarily relevant even in the final weeks of the collapsing campaign. He had answered their questions with the minimum information necessary to avoid the consequences of non-cooperation and had otherwise maintained the bearing of a man who considered the entire proceeding beneath him. When he was brought to 3rd Army headquarters for the senior interrogation session, he arrived in the same manner. Correct? Compliant in the narrowest technical sense. and radiating from every aspect of his bearing and his expression and the specific quality of his silence between answers, a contempt for the process, and the people conducting it that he had apparently decided was his last available form of resistance, now that the military options had been exhausted. The session was being conducted in a converted office in the headquarters building, the standard functional space that the business of processing captured senior officers happened in. Patton was present not as the primary interrogator, which was not his role, but because the general's reported knowledge of German defensive dispositions in the eastern area of the Third Army's advance was considered potentially significant enough to warrant the commanding general's direct attention. He was at the side of the room, reviewing documents, present but not at the table, the way a senior commander is present in an operational space without being the operational focus of it. The interrogation proceeded through the standard preliminary questions. Name, rank, unit, current operational knowledge. The general answered with the minimum necessary. The American intelligence officer conducting the session pushed for more specificity on the defensive dispositions. The general demurred. The intelligence officer pushed again. The general looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided that the person talking to him is not worth the full deployment of his attention, and said something in German that the interpreter translated as a suggestion that the Americans would find out about the defensive dispositions when they encountered them, and that the general had nothing further to contribute on the subject. At which point the intelligence officer, who had been dealing with this quality of contemptuous non-cooperation for the entire session, and whose patience had reached its operational limit, told the general directly that his cooperation was required under the terms of the surrender agreement, and that continued refusal would have consequences for his processing and treatment. The general looked at the intelligence officer for a moment, then he looked across the room at Patton, and then he stood up from his chair, walked 4 steps across the room, and slapped Patton across the face with his open hand. Typed the word disrespect in the comments if you need a moment to process what you just heard. Because what that general did in that room was not just an act of physical aggression. It was a statement, a deliberate, calculated public statement made by a man who had decided that the only form of resistance remaining to him was the most personal and most direct form of contempt he could express, and who had chosen to express it on the face of the man who represented everything that had defeated him. The room went completely, absolutely, totally silent. According to the account of the intelligence officer who was conducting the session, preserved in a letter written to his wife 3 days after the incident and now held in the private family archive that his daughter shared with a researcher working on Third Army history in the 2000s. The silence that followed the slap was unlike any silence he had experienced in 3 years of active service in one of the most violent campaigns in American military history. He wrote that it was not the silence of shock, though shock was certainly present. It was the silence of a room full of people who had simultaneously realized that something was happening that none of them had a prepared response for, and that the outcome of the next few seconds was going to be determined entirely by one man, and that all any of the rest of them could do was wait and see what that man decided. Every person in that room was looking at Patton. What they saw on his face in the seconds immediately following the slap is described in 3 independent accounts. The intelligence officer's letter, the written record of the military police sergeant who was stationed at the door, and the diary entry of a Third Army staff officer who arrived at the room shortly after and received a first-hand account from 2 people who had been present, with a consistency that tells you it burned itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. They all describe the same thing: stillness. Not the stillness of a man who has been stunned, not the paralysis of someone who has been genuinely overwhelmed by something unexpected. The stillness of a man who has been handed something and is deciding, with every ounce of the iron self-control that he had spent a lifetime building, exactly what to do with it. The intelligence officer wrote that it lasted approximately 11 seconds. The military police sergeant said it felt much longer than it actually was. The staff officer who received the second-hand account said that both people who described it to him used the word terrifying independently of each other, and that when he asked them why they used that specific word, they both said essentially the same thing: that the rage was obviously there, that you could feel it in the room the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a storm, but that it was not coming out. That Patton was holding it somewhere inside him with a deliberateness that was more frightening than the explosion would have been, because at least an explosion, you know the shape of. Then Patton spoke, and again, across 3 independent accounts, the first thing that every witness noted was not what he said, but how he said it. Quietly, in a voice that the intelligence officer described as the most controlled thing he had ever heard come out of a human being who was visibly, physically furious. In a voice that the military police sergeant said made the hair on the back of his neck stand up because it was so far below the volume the situation seemed to demand. In a voice that the staff officer's sources both described, again independently, as the voice of a man who had made a decision and was now executing it with complete precision. He told the general through the interpreter that he had just made a significant error in his assessment of the situation, that he had apparently concluded, based on some calculation that Patton was genuinely curious about, that the most strategically sound option available to him in this room at this moment was to physically strike the commanding general of the United States Third Army. He told the general he would like to understand the reasoning behind that conclusion because, from where he was standing, it appeared to reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of his current circumstances. According to the intelligence officer's account, the general said nothing. His bearing, which had been the rigid professional composure he had maintained throughout the session, had changed. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion, but something in the structure of it had shifted. The way a structure shifts when something load-bearing inside it has given way. Patton continued. He told the general that he was going to do something now that he suspected the general had not anticipated and that he wanted the general to pay close attention to because it was going to tell him something important about the difference between the army that had just defeated him and the army he had spent his career serving. He told the general that he was not going to hit him back. He let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he explained why. Not because he lacked the inclination, which he acknowledged directly and without embarrassment, in a way that several witnesses found startling in its honesty. He had the inclination, strongly. What had just happened to his face had produced a response in him that he was not going to pretend was anything other than what it was, but he was not going to act on it. And the reason he was not going to act on it had nothing to do with the general and everything to do with what Patton believed about the difference between a man who was controlled by his impulses and a man who controlled them. According to the intelligence officer's letter, which is the most detailed of the three accounts, and which appears to have been written while the memory was still completely fresh, Patton told the general that the United States Army had a rule about striking prisoners, that the rule existed not because prisoners deserved special consideration as individuals, but because the rule was a statement about what kind of army the United States intended to be. That an army that struck prisoners was an army that had decided its own discipline and its own standards were negotiable when the provocation was sufficient, and that an army with negotiable standards was not an army, it was a mob with equipment. He told the general that he had spent his entire career building and maintaining and enforcing the standards that separated an army from a mob, that he had relieved officers for violations of those standards, that he had disciplined soldiers for violations of those standards, and that he was not going to stand in a room and undermine everything he had spent 40 years building because a German general whose army had just been comprehensively defeated had decided that slapping him was a meaningful act of resistance. He told the general that the slap had accomplished exactly one thing. It had told everyone in the room something about the general that the interrogation had not. It had told them that this was a man who, in the moment when all the institutional power that had backed his identity for his entire career had been stripped away, had nothing left but the gesture. That the gesture was all he had, and that a man whose last resource is a gesture is a man who has already lost everything that actually mattered. Then he sat back down and told the intelligence officer to continue the interrogation. According to all three accounts, the German general answered the questions about the defensive dispositions, completely, without further resistance of any kind. The formal documentation of the incident, the slap and Patton's response, and the subsequent cooperation of the general went into the Third Army operational record and into the general's processing file. According to the military intelligence assessment filed following the session, the information provided by the general about German defensive dispositions in the eastern sector of the Third Army's advance proved operationally useful in the final weeks of the campaign, allowing American units to avoid two prepared defensive positions that would have resulted in significant casualties if approached without foreknowledge. The general was transferred to the standard prisoner of war processing system following the session. His file, including the documentation of the slapping incident, was forwarded to the War Crimes Investigation Unit that was beginning the enormous work of assessing potential charges against captured German officers. Whether the slapping incident itself constituted a chargeable offense under the relevant conventions was a question that the legal officers reviewing the file apparently spent some time on, given the specific and unusual nature of the act. The conclusion, documented in a brief legal memorandum preserved in the National Archives, was that while the act was clearly a violation of the conventions governing the conduct of prisoners of war, The commanding general's decision not to pursue formal charges and his explicit statement in the operational record that he considered the matter resolved made formal prosecution on the slapping charge alone inadvisable. Patton had apparently been asked, before the file was forwarded, whether he wished to pursue the charge. According to the account of the judge advocate officer who delivered the question, preserved in the officer's memoir written after the war, Patton had listened to the question and then said that he did not, that the general had answered the questions and that the information had been useful, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. The judge advocate officer wrote that he had pressed slightly, noting that the incident was documented and that a charge would be supportable, and that Patton had looked at him and said something that the officer included in his memoir because he had been thinking about it for 30 years. Patton had said that the slap had already cost the general more than any charge would, that every officer in that room had watched a German general strike, the commanding general of the Third Army, and then answer every question he had spent the entire session refusing to answer. That the sequence of events was in the record and everyone who read the record would understand what it meant. That the general had tried to use the only weapon he had left and it had done nothing except demonstrate exactly how empty that weapon was. And that documenting that outcome was a more complete accounting of what had happened in that room than any formal charge would produce. The judge advocate officer wrote that he had not had a response to that and had closed his file and left. The story of what happened in that room traveled through the Third Army, the way the significant stories always traveled through Patton's army, faster than official communication and with a fidelity to emotional truth that official communication rarely achieved. And what the soldiers who heard it responded to was not the slap, though the audacity of the slap alone was enough to produce a reaction. What they responded to was what came after it. The 11 seconds, the quiet voice, the decision not to hit back, and the specific reasoning behind that decision. The information that their commanding general, the man with the revolvers and the helmet and the speeches, had been slapped in the face by a German general and had responded by sitting back down and continuing the interrogation, according to the letters home written by Third Army soldiers in the weeks following the incident, several of which are preserved in the collections of the National World War II Museum and various university archives. The story produced a reaction that surprised some of the officers who heard it reported. They expected the soldiers to be outraged on Patton's behalf, which many of them were, but the more consistent and more significant reaction, the one that came up again and again in the letters, was something closer to pride, not pride in the slap, pride in the response, pride in the specific quality of self-control that the response had demonstrated. One soldier wrote to his mother that he had always known Patton was the toughest man in the army, but that he had not understood until he heard this story what tough actually meant. That he had thought it meant not feeling things, that he now understood it meant feeling everything and deciding what to do with it anyway. That soldier's letter, preserved in his family's private archive and shared with the researcher who compiled the oral history of the 4th Armored Division, contains what is probably the most accurate summary of what happened in that room that exists in the historical record. Not because it is the most detailed, it is not, but because it identifies the thing that made the incident significant in a way that the operational record, with its formal language and its institutional priorities, was not designed to capture. Patton had been given an opportunity to be exactly the thing he had spent his entire career performing: the man of pure aggression. The man without an interior life complicated enough to require restraint, the man who hit back because hitting back was what old blood and guts did, and he had declined. He had stood in a room with a red mark on his face, and 11 seconds of absolute silence and the eyes of every officer present watching him, and he had made a different decision, harder decision. The decision that the standards he had spent 40 years building and enforcing were worth more than the satisfaction of the response that every instinct in his body was demanding. That is not the Patton of the mythology. The mythology would have had him draw one of the ivory revolvers. The mythology would have had the explosion and the profanity and the theatrical violence that made for better stories and simpler heroes. The real Patton sat back down and told the intelligence officer to continue the interrogation. And the German general who had run out of weapons and tried a gesture answered every question he had spent the session refusing to answer, because that is what happens when you meet genuine self-control with a gesture. The gesture runs out, and the self-control is still there. Type the word control in the comments if this story changed something in how you understand what Patton actually was, because I want to know how many of you are seeing what I'm seeing in that room. The man underneath the mythology, the one who was harder to understand and more worth understanding than the version on the posters. If this story reached you in a place that the official history never gets to, do one thing before you close this video: Hit the like button, not for the algorithm, for the 11 seconds. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep going into the history that was too human and too complicated and too honest to make it into the textbooks the way it actually happened. Turn on notifications so you never miss one of these. And leave your honest response in the comments, because I read every single one and that conversation is the most valuable thing this channel produces. I will see you in the next one.